So my idea for this is I was going to go through sort of and just riff on the medium of audio, talk about that a little bit, and then go through different styles of audio
Mhm.
that affect how you're writing and affect what type of show it is. And then I was thinking to go quickly into why audio is a good opportunity, like why you as a writer should seriously consider audio.
Mhm.
And then I have about 5 or 6 scripts to pull up that we can walk through, that I can go through, and we can talk about it from there.
I think that's a perfect menu for the show.
Great. And then if there are any questions, please interrupt me because that'll make it much more interesting. I
Will
guarantee you.
do. Will do. Well, okay, why don't we just go right from there? So, hey, friends, welcome to the Catholic Author Show. Today we are joined by Peter Atkinson. I had him over on my other show, Mastermind for Smart Catholics, and he's graciously accepted to come back and host a kind of a mini workshop for the Catholic author community. So, if you haven't seen his kind of intro, meet Peter in 15 minutes, I will link that video. You can head on over to there. Peter, in 30 seconds, tell us about the Merry Beggars and Relevant Radio and what it is you do.
All right, 30 seconds. My name is
And
Peter
go.
Atkinson. I am the founder and the director of the Merry Beggars. We are the entertainment division of Relevant Radio. We produce original audio programming for a national audience. Relevant Radio has over 196 radio towers across the United States with a potential audience of over 200 million. And so about a year ago, Father Rocky, who's the CEO of Relevant Radio, and I connected, and we said, well, why don't we join forces? And so that's where I am. So we produce original scripts. We're going to be doing a lot of original programming over the next year. That was 30.
uh, Perfect. So, today we're talking about how to take or how to consider or conceive of a story for radio. And the reason why I think this is a particularly phenomenal workshop to be able to bring to the Catholic author community is sharing with Peter when we were last chatting how we have contests that we run. We've got this website called Legend Fiction for publishing short stories. We've got a community of people who are creating stories all the time, and some of the authors in here are just phenomenal. So being able to kind of partner or point people over to the Merry Beggars as here's an opportunity. Here is a team that are looking for content, cool content, to turn it into audio drama that can then go on,
Mm.
well, relevant radio to reach a national audience. Obviously, there's no guarantee that everything you send will be accepted, but that's kind of what we're all about with today with this workshop. So I'm going to, well, turn the mic back over to Peter. The idea, as you just outlined, is how to think about taking a story and turning it into something ready for radio, or how do we think about radio drama and creating content for radio?
Yeah, and I just want to say to your audience, I'm an artist. I went to Columbia University in New York City to train as an actor, and I performed as an actor, and so on and so forth. And I did a lot of work with writers or with actors and artists in New York City. And the thing that I found, the best way to support artists is to pay them and to produce their work, which is a shocker. It's a huge revelation. Or at least it actually was for me. And so now what the Merry Beggars is doing, and the reason why I'm excited to talk to your audience is we are now in a position to be able to work with, employ, develop new material with, and pay writers across the United States. And we have an ongoing content need for that. Um, One of the shows that your audience might be interested in is it's a show called That New Revival. And we're going to launch it next March, March of 2023. And if anyone is familiar with Garrison Keillor and Prairie Home Companion, they'll be familiar with sort of the format of a radio variety show. We are going to have 1 hour of that being released every single week, which means that we need anywhere between 30 and 60 minutes of scripts every single week. And we pay writers, which is a great thing.
Wow.
So one of the things that I'm hoping to do in this workshop is to sort of lay out what the land of audio looks like currently, because as a writer, you need to know who you're writing for, you need to know what audience you're writing for, and you need to know what are the successful mediums, the successful styles, the successful projects that you can learn from.
Mm.
An audio story is not the same as a short story. It's not the same as a novel. It's not the same as anything else. It just is its own thing. And audio stories are not the same as each other, right? A podcast is not the same as a radio show, which is not the same, and a BBC radio show is not the same as an American radio show. So I'm excited to connect to your audience because I think that if your audience is interested in getting their work produced, if your audience is interested in getting your work produced in front of a national audience, and finding other artists to collaborate with, then we have that. That's what we're looking for. So, in the workshop, I hope to. And Dominic, as I said before, please just hop in and interrupt me at any point. But throughout the workshop, I'm going to try and go through what writing for audio looks like, what adapting your existing work to audio looks like, the different audio styles that you'll play with, the sort of lay of the land of audio as it stands right now. And then we'll go through some scripts and just look very quickly, but look at different ways of writing. So very quickly, the first thing I wanted to cover was what adapting something that you're writing currently to an audio format can look like, or what do you have to do, right? So say you have a short story, and say, Bozo the dog has a bone and he buries the bone, but then he has remorse because he realizes that he really should have shared this bone with his girlfriend, whose name, I don't know, it's a female dog named Dominic.
I
Putting
don't
you on the
know.
spot.
Yeah, now I'm thinking Baza, and it's like, that's dumb. But
Baza, all
whatever.
right, Bozo and Baza, very uncreative dog owners. But
Yep.
he realizes he should have shared this bone with Baza, and so he digs up this bone and he delivers it to Baza, and they're happily ever after, right? So the short story version of that is you have Bozo's interior life, you have the dog's interior struggles with guilt. Is he really committed to this Judeo-Christian worldview where
Right,
sharing
right.
is caring, as we all learn on the playground? Or is he, an Ayn Randian nihilist, and he seeks to become a Nietzschean Ubermensch of a dog, or so and so, right? So this is the interior life, right?
Uber Rover, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
And the
Uber
description of the yard, the annoying squirrel, why he picked that
exactly, right?
area.
The
Yep.
grass wafts under the breeze, so and so. But none of that is an audio. None of that is an audio. So the question is how do you take the story of Bozo the dog, right, where you have his interior life, and you translate that into an audio story or a radio story? There are a couple ways. One of the options that people opt for a lot is a device called the narrator, right? And you can have the narrator in various forms. So you can have the sort of omniscient narrator. They did this in an old radio show called The Shadow. And on The Shadow, you would hear, or actually, they would have it on The Shadow, would be the character of The Shadow would narrate. But then on The Whistler, you would have this omniscient sort of supernatural character narrate everything. So you could have a narrator come in and say, well, Bozo the dog felt guilty, so on and so forth. The other thing you could do is you could have a confessional narration where the character or the main character would be writing his confession of the events, right? Like, I'm so sorry. I feel terrible about this bone. And you have to turn
So
all of
it's like a
the
running monologue of what
exactly.
you're thinking. You're in their head the whole time, and they're talking.
Exactly. And you
Okay.
would have to turn the external events into an interior dialogue that is dialogue. It's not,
Okay.
there's no third person view. It's all done through stream of consciousness or conversation with himself or with others in sort of a confessional. And then the other would be, similarly, would be some sort of journal, right? And which is sort of a style of confession. So you could have this narrator device that helps translate interior life and descriptions into audio that the audience is able to hear. Now, the reason that I don't really like that when I'm adapting for radio is, or I try to use it very sparingly, is because modern audiences are used to sort of cinematic experiences. So
Right.
modern audiences like watching movies and visual mediums more than almost anything else. So if we want to get them to listen to an audio medium, we have to try and avoid it just being sort of a 1940s nostalgic piece. And so in that case, what do? How do you communicate the story? If you're not having a narrator, then you have to have the action either embedded in the dialogue, like for instance, Sammy, why did you hit me? Right? Or, ow, this glass is really sharp. And you would have the character actually describe the thing that is happening to them. Now, it can get a little cheesy. It can get a little cheesy, but you can do it subtly, right? Like this door won't open, or something similar to that. And then the only other option, if you don't want to have that, is to have the action be so clear that sound effects are able to communicate um, that they're able to communicate the action of the story.
Mhm.
Now, my preference is to move away from narration because it feels a little cliched and old. If you click on a podcast and it says, Joey was standing there in the room alone. He had a hat. It's just like, all right, am I listening to an audiobook, or am I listening to a radio show, or am I listening to a movie? Like,
And that actually sounds like a pretty valuable distinction to make between an audiobook, which would be just the
yes,
reading aloud, and maybe having different people just read aloud the voices as it's printed on the page, versus what you're talking about, which is producing for audio or for radio or
yeah. And the thing is because this has had a resurgence. So audio listening, more people are listening to audio now than have ever listened to before in the history of the world, right? They're because of the AirPods and the smartphones, more people are listening than ever before, which is great because the audience is larger than ever before. But the terminology hasn't really caught up, and so it's sort of a little clunky of like, do you call it an audio drama? Do you call it a radio show? Do you call it a so on and so forth? But the distinction that you're pointing out, Dominic, is you have audiobooks where you're actually just reading the text, and then you have a radio drama. And it's my belief, if you're doing an audio drama or a radio drama, you have to be careful about how you use a narrator voice so that
Mhm.
it doesn't so that it can sound fresh, right?
Right.
It's tricky. So
Mhm.
that's sort of the main thing when you're honestly writing for audio is like, how do you, it's not too complicated, but how do you communicate the action of the story? If you only
Is
have
is
dialogue,
yeah.
sound effects, music, and maybe a little narration, how do you communicate the action of the story? You're going to say,
Gotcha. No, I was just going to say, is it like watching a movie with your eyes closed, or watching a Shakespearean play but with your eyes closed, and all you have is what the characters can say to each other, and then what you can hear, like you said, with a little bit
yeah.
of narration in there.
And so that's the thing is like, the answer is it can be any of those, which is paralyzing when you're a writer because it's like, okay, well, what do I do?
Yeah.
I think you have to, if you're writing, you have to give yourself constraints. And there are different types of audio that you can write for. So most of the audio that we hear is usually podcasts, like, just people talking to each other, like, oh, what did you do for your weekend? So on and so forth. That's not what we're doing at all. The other type of audio that most people hear is commercials, right? And this is overproduced sort of Doritos commercials, whatever, where everything sounds like this and everyone is toxically positive all the time. Um, and if you
Okay.
don't, so neither of those are what we're aiming for, right? We're not aiming for overly produced commercial audio. We're not aiming for relaxed two bros hanging out, drinking beer, and thinking that they have the answers to life. We're aiming for some version of storytelling. And in the storytelling world, you have sort of movies for your ears, which is if you listen to the podcast Homecoming, or there's a podcast called The Truth, which is all sort of audio drama, radio dramas. It's really well produced. Um, those are trying to be cinematic audio for your ears, right? It's trying to communicate it without a narrator, with just really, really good sound design and
Mhm.
very clear dialogue.
Mhm.
And the best way to learn how to adapt for audio is just to listen to a ton of audio. So growing up, I used to listen to tons of old radio shows. If you go to archive.org and search up old time radio single episodes, you will find hundreds of thousands of single episodes. And if you want to write for audio, then I would just suggest start listening to that stuff. So Homecoming is sort of cinematic audio. What we do is I would consider, at least up till now, cinematic audio, we're trying to produce audio without a narrator so that you can sort of see it in your head. And then there's more cartoonish audio like Adventures in Odyssey, where you have a narrator. It's not trying to be as highly produced. It's not trying to be as cinematic. So it just depends on what genre you're writing, and that depends on what company you're trying to write for. So if you're writing for, if you're writing for that new revival, that's going to have a particular style of voice, of so on and so forth. So yeah, you sort of have to know what company you're writing for, what audience, and what format, and so on and so forth. So why don't we hop into, I thought I would show you how we adapted a Christmas. We did a project. Thank you, Google Books. We did a project, Christmas Carol. This is just the actual text of a Christmas Carol. Starts out with Marley's Ghost. Hopefully everyone knows generally the story. I grew up with this story. I've loved it my whole life. And so it was a natural fit of, we're going to adapt this. And if you read it, right, and this is sort of a fun, creative way of dealing with the narrator voice. Because if you read a Christmas Carol, it's 90% narrator.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with the narrator voice in an audio drama if you don't want it to be cheesy, you don't want it to be cartoonish, you want it to not just be a nostalgia piece, but you want it to be cinematic. So we can read through, Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead to begin with. There's no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Now, Dominic, say you were producing this. What would be your first sort of stab in the dark? And you don't have to come up with a brilliant answer because we had months and you have seconds.
I'm trying to do that, and I don't know. Either two guys talking at a bar about it, Scrooge and somebody else, or
that's a good idea. I like that.
Somebody wanting to hire Marley and learning that he's not available, or somebody reading a eulogy while he's being sunk in the ground and it's raining.
I like all of those ideas. I think those are great. I think if we were going to adapt that, I would do it that way. I would probably opt for someone trying to hire Marley and him learning that he's not available, and then sort of gossip around the watering hole of Scrooge. He took everything, and I wouldn't go to Scrooge, and you have this sort of conversation that is exposition, just like in a film, and you're able to communicate most of this. That's a good idea. I like that. Now we want a different option, and the reason
I'm going to ask, what did you?
I know, it's interesting. Different option. Let me share the actual script that we produced. If I can pull that up, I believe this is it. Yeah. So the actual beginning here, the actual script that we produced, we ended up doing something a little bit different, and the reason for that was we had weeks to adapt this. So I spent about 2.5 weeks adapting this, working nonstop, and writing all of this. And I wanted to be able to have a cinematic quality, but I knew that we didn't have time to do a full movie adaptation of what this could look like. So what I ended up doing was we spent the first episode, we called it Mr. Dickens. It's totally extraneous to the actual plot. And we opened each one with this really immersive, beautiful scene of an 1800s English culture. So you had wagon wheels, you had choirs in the distance, you had so on and so forth. So trying to get you out of the audiobook space and directly into this is a movie, right?
Wow.
And we had the choir, and then we had an actual narrator, and this we could afford to be a little nostalgic. Where it was me saying, for your avid enjoyment, you, our radio listeners, direct address, which is something you don't want to do very often, but we thought it fit this project. You're invited to travel back, and we had just had this little snippet of a narrator at the beginning, and then we went right into the characters of an old man and a boy. And we used these characters, the old man and a boy, you encounter these characters and they take you into a theater in Victorian London where Charles Dickens is reading, he's doing a public reading of A Christmas Carol
How cool.
for the first time ever. And this is something Charles Dickens actually did a lot. It's how he became famous, or it's how he earned a lot of money in his life. And so we did this sort of meta thing where we had one narrator sort of like, thank you for listening. And then you were swept into this adventure where by episode 2, you know, they talk about, they started making fun of Edgar Allan Poe and Tennyson and all these different things. And then by, you have a presenter come in and he presents the character of Charles Dickens reading A Christmas Carol. And then by the end of episode 1, we've set up Charles Dickens not as a narrator, but as a character inside a world that the audience can listen to. And then later on, and we can look at that exact moment, right? So we actually retained Marley was Ted to begin with. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman. But it's not a narrator of an audiobook. It's a character of Charles Dickens in the world who's able to give the text expression, who's able to sell the audience. He's able to perform the text. He's not an omniscient narrator. He's a historical figure. And then we would do these vignettes where we would go into the clergyman and Scrooge at the funeral of Marley. So, you know, my condolences, Mr. Ebenezer. He's gone on to his reward now. He's at peace. Quite. And even Scrooge, and it would go on. And so you would do these vignettes where, as Dickens would do narration, there would be sound effects and sort of world building around it. And so this is one approach to adapting your writing, right?
The value I'm seeing, I'm assuming, it would be you're able to preserve big chunks of the text. You're not having to add tons of new characters to give fresh insight into everything that's happening. Especially with Scrooge, he spends a lot of time in introspection in his upper room throughout the story. And I mean, unless you're Jim Carrey, it's screaming all the time. But
right.
So keeping your Dickens character makes a lot of sense.
Well, also, and this is sort of a cheap example in one sense, because what's unique about this project is, for anyone who loves Dickens, what you love about Dickens is Dickens. Right. Like, you love his descriptions, you love his the way he characterizes things, so on and so forth. And we found a pretty good balance of, you know, we had to cut a lot of Charles Dickens because he would go on and it would be like, all right, this needs to go.
Channeling into Tolkien.
Yeah, well, even worse than Tolkien. And yet we would find these vignettes to throw in. So just simple things as cab, yes, thank you, where to, sir, Scrooge and Marley, then the law offices, yes, cabby, is like, we could have gotten rid of some of the narration if we wanted to with these vignettes, but it served to sort of support the overall storytelling. Now, one thing to note too for the authors that are going to be watching this and for yourself is, this is one example of formatting where you have the characters off to the left and then the lines off to the right slightly. And then the sound effects are described in all caps underlined. And this is a pretty simple radio format. It sort of models the BBC radio format.
Okay.
You don't need to do it this way. There's no standardized format. It's the same as screenwriting in the sense of, find out what the company that you're trying to work with wants in a format, and they will tell you exactly what they want. And then you should do exactly what they want. We use another format that I can pull up. This is a format we're actually switching to for our upcoming production. We switched to it for our upcoming production, and it follows more of a here, I'll share this screen. It follows more of a format that you would see in a screen. And this is an example, a story in which there is no narrator whatsoever. So in this, so this is On the Night Train. You can go to onthenighttrain.com to learn more, or you will be able to by the end of next week. So onthenighttrain.com is a very complex story in the sense that it's set in 1879. We needed to tell the audience that there was a race between Webster Wagner and his Midnight Express and George Pullman's Night Train, and they are racing across America as two trains trying to be the first transcontinental passenger train across America. And two children, Edith and Paul, are going to be traveling on board this train, and their father, Will Mallard, runs one of the trains. So how do you tell that story? Like, how do you set up that story? Now, if you were writing a short story, you would probably go into, in this society, railroad barons ruled the day, little children couldn't get apple scraps to eat. And you would try to channel your best tale of two cities and sort of set the scene, right? That, have the clouds of pollution. No, we can't do that in audio. So what do? Well, we get some of the most iconic characters in all of entertainment, which are news barkers, which are slightly anachronistic to the 1880s, I think. But these news barkers come in, and again, I really believe in really high quality sound design to set the scene. We have horses clopping, carriages rolling, so on and so forth. And we use the barkers to do our exposition. Good morning, Chicago. Wake up. The world is changing. Don't be left behind. It's New Year's Eve, so on and so forth. So you're plunged into the story. They accomplish your exposition. They set the scene. They the trick with writing for audio is everything has to be in the dialogue, but you have to consistently follow the same rules. You can't have the dialogue ever be. So you constantly have to follow inciting incident, rising action, climax, falling action, denouement. Like, you have to follow that arc, the Aristotelian story arc, in every scene with every dialogue, so on and so forth. So in this one, you have the inciting incident is "Good morning, Chicago." They're yelling. The rising action is New Year's Eve, last day of 1879. They're telling you sort of exposition, and then it ends on the button or the climax of the scene, the race across America. So even every scene has that same natural arc, and that keeps the audience hooked. One of the things that I've learned as an audio producer is in audio, your audience has about 3 to 5 seconds before they tune out. If you start listening to audio and you're not into it, you will just close it down. So you have to have a hook or something that will hook your audience in. And "Good morning, Chicago, wake up, 1880th Street" is a pretty good hook. And then this is just sort of fun to look at, is the first scene of the entire series. You have a detailed soundscape, sound of the barkers come back in, fading in underneath the music. One thing I would suggest to all your writers is don't describe the scene unless it's a sound effect or dialogue or very basic information like the year, right? You can get away with some of that. You need to put it in either sound effects or in dialogue. Why? Because if you describe it in your mind, you'll think, oh, the audience will get this. But unless it's in a sound effect or it's in dialogue, there is no way for the audience to actually get that information. And when I've worked with writers, what I've found is that they'll leave out things in dialogue or not realize they need to put it in a sound effect or sound design because they'll think, oh, well, this is in the scene description, or this is, so on and so forth. So
it takes show don't tell to a whole new level.
Oh, it's 100% show don't tell.
Yeah. But what I'm loving about hearing this is it's making so much sense to just learn this as an approach to just improving your craft in storytelling anyway, to improve your dialogue, to actually make the dialogue pull its weight in the story, not just for radio or audio, but in just general storytelling. I think it's very 19th century and 18th century to have huge blocks of exposition. It's far more modern, from what I can tell today, to be far snappier, far more immediate, far more precise with your descriptions, and then all the focus goes into characterization, character involvement, dialogue, and so on. And this is like phenomenal.
Yeah.
Exercise.
So with developing audio stories, some of the things that I found, when we were developing, we spent a year and a half developing these scripts with about 4 people working on them, more people reading them, and it was full-time jobs. Like,
Wow.
it was intense. we started off the right way, which is we drew up an outline of the plot. We didn't start writing. We drew out an outline of the plot. We wrote pages of background information on every character. And then we started to develop an overall schema of the plot. And we started editing the schema of the plot before we ever started writing any scene. And that allowed us to get sort of a grip on the storytelling. The thing that I've seen happen in stories a lot is, and this applies to all storytelling, but it's especially evident in audio, your character needs stakes. The character needs to have a really strong objective, and there needs to be a really big obstacle preventing him or her from getting to that objective, which then creates the conflict, which is the story, right?
Mhm.
With no conflict, no story. On the Night Train, a lot of the times when both working with the actors and working with Kylie, the writer, who's just a wonderful playwright, I would constantly say to her, like, this is a good scene. The characters are strong, but where is the stakes? Where are the stakes? What do they want? What is the objective in the scene? And a lot of this comes from my acting background, which has helped me a lot as a producer. But you need to be able to say, Georgie wants the cookie, and it is so strong that he's willing to overcome any obstacle. And the problem is that his house is on fire. And yet he is willing to figure out a way into the kitchen, which has not burned down yet. And his parents are trying to prevent it, right? That's not a good story, but it's a story. There's a conflict there. And then the dialogue springs off that. Anytime dialogue is not working, you have to go back to the fundamentals of character having an objective and an obstacle being in the way of that objective, which then creates conflict, which then is the action of the story. And that structure applies to an entire series. It applies to a scene. It even applies to conversations inside a scene, right? You might have an entire series, like The Night Train. The entire series is two kids want to go on the train to California. Their obstacle is lots of sabotage trying to destroy the night train. And so they have to solve the sabotage to get to California and protect their dad's job on the night train. That's the entire arc. Inside an episode, it's they were left off of the train, or actually, inside an episode, it's the train is stopped because a bridge has been down. So they have to wait until the bridge is repaired, and then they'll get. And inside a scene in that episode is they were left outside of the train, and the train is leaving, and they have to race to catch up to the train, right? And there's the objective, the characters with a desire, with something blocking that desire, and then they have the conflict to get over that. And then inside that scene, there's dialogue of the kids are running after the train. They want to get inside the kitchen car, but the door won't open. Bam. Anytime dialogue or character is not working, I have like 5 tricks that I'd use when I'm working with writers. I don't really know too many things, but I know these 5 things. And one that always works is anytime dialogue isn't working, anytime plot isn't working, it's always going back to, are the characters strong? Do they have a really strong objective? And is there a big enough obstacle that they're trying to get past? And then the dialogue comes from that. And you lose a lot of fluff and audio around dialogue. But if you have the fundamentals strong, then the storytelling is just very straightforward. It's just very one of the biggest revelations for me as a producer was just learning the structure of writing. And with audio, you don't have anything to hide behind. Like, it's
Yeah.
plot, right? You don't have descriptions. You don't have interior thoughts. You don't have feelings of guilt, except insofar as they're expressed in action or dialogue. Like, it's all, to me, when I'm working with writers and producing audio, it's all about, is the structure strong? Are the fundamentals strong? And then just figuring out how you communicate that through sound effects and through audio. That's sort of my take when I'm
Mhm.
working on different scripts.
Yeah. For those who are doing that, who either have existing stories and think, hey, this could be really cool because I've got a ton of characters doing stuff and there's a lot of dialogue in here, and I could see that being even more dialogue to kind of communicate the story. You said the word fluff in your dialogue. How do you avoid that, or what should you look for to avoid fluff in dialogue? And the sort of ancillary problem of, well, if I've got to describe my whole scene and what I look like and what this scene looks like and the fact that there's smoke in the sky, like you mentioned smog
Mm.
in 18th century London, whatever. How do you avoid being over obvious? Because I've heard this with other either audiobooks or radio shows where it's like nobody would ever actually talk that way.
Yes.
And it's going on for too long. I know you mentioned there's a certain level of hokiness you kind of have to put up with, but how would you parse that?
Um, what I've seen every producer and casting director trust more than anything is just their gut about when they get bored. If and it's all really hard to do this with your own writing, right? Is like because you think your writing is amazing, it's your
Yeah.
precious child, right?
And also where it's going to end up. Maybe they're going
Yes.
through it the first time.
If you think about movies, James Bond never so a lot of it depends on genre, right? A lot of it depends whether you're writing an action film, a comedy, or whatever, right? My genres, which I have a bias towards, are science fiction and mystery. I love both those genres. I think science fiction and mystery work really well for audio because mystery is very cerebral. Audio works very well with puzzles and thinking through things and sort of more cerebral stuff. And
Mhm.
science fiction is great because you can create a $15 million spaceship for $5 using sound effects, and it just communicates the visuals like that. It's awesome. But depending on what genre you're writing, there's for action, right? There should never be any physical description unless it applies to the plot. I mean, I would be very suspicious of like physical description, right? You don't what color is James Bond's hair, or like
Mhm.
what does James Bond ever really describe? James Bond is a good example of like the dialogue is always service to the plot,
Mhm.
and what I do, my method for doing what you're talking about is breaking down the structure into a schema. So let me actually pull up the schema for. I don't know if schema is a word that lots of other people use when referring to this, but that's what we use internally. So this is the writing, and this is writing resources, and this is the schema that we used. So this schema is not totally accurate to everything because we edited a bunch of things going forward. But this is what we used to plot the entire structure of On the Night Train. We used bullet point by bullet point by bullet point to go through the action of the going through the action of the story and finding the plot points that actually need to happen. And then the writer, when she was working through this, would would refer to this schema as she was writing. And
Mhm.
so when she was going through and editing the dialogue, um, a lot of it depends upon taste, like, Kylie, the playwright, has a real gift for writing family dynamics and a gift for writing, really funny character things. But sometimes, she would have the characters talking about blueberry pancakes, and blueberry pancakes are great, but they talked about them a lot, and so I was like, "Kylie, this needs to go." And so we
Okay.
just said, "Okay, this needs to go, it doesn't serve the plot," and it left forevermore. So it's hard to give sort of a cut and dry answer because it's so much of it is prudence and taste.
Mhm.
But I find that having a solid structure, a plot structure that you're confident in allows you to have a lot more freedom with cutting and adding back in dialogue. Does that answer your question? Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And, uh, I think kind of a case in point is with legend fiction, the project that we run with Catholic Author. I see a lot of stories come in for the contests and so on, and invariably I see a lot of description that people go to, like, "Oh, here's what he looked like or she looked like," and their eye color, and they catch a glimpse of themselves in the mirror because we got to get that in. And then more recently, I was tackling one of my own stories and realized it actually doesn't matter at all what my character looks like. I'm just going to let the reader fill that in and just get right to who is she, not what does she look like, and have her doing things immediately. And it sounds like that's going to that would translate better into the kind of thing that you're talking about here, unless there's some like really amazing, like you got a redhead, or a shock of hair. You're totally bald except for a braid, like something
Yeah,
that
and
actually contributes to the character.
I'll also say so. This is a method that we got from Buzz McLaughlin, who's a wonderful writer, playwright, and teacher who you know as well. And we developed these character files that
Oh,
go through
cool.
exactly all of the different physical traits, the family situation, the religious beliefs, the political beliefs, if they have any of either, their
Mhm.
marital status, close friends, place in community, interior world, leisure times activities, so on and so forth.
Nice.
Because
Okay.
when you're writing stories for audio and you want them to be grounded and beautiful and cinematic, you need to have answers to all of the questions, right?
Mhm.
You need to have answers to the questions of what her hair color is and how confident she is, and what her skin color is, what her hair color is. Does she have trauma in her past? Like all that stuff. Think through that stuff. You have to do that stuff,
Yes.
but don't put it all in the writing
Mhm.
because it will come through. I mean, think about real life dialogue, right? I don't know you very well. I don't know your backstory, but I know so much about you by the way that you're using your intonation and your voice to communicate, right? Like the person's soul comes through their voice. And that's the
Mhm.
beautiful thing about audio, right? As an actor, I was trained a lot in how to let my entire experience come through in my vocal quality, right? Um, it's amazing. It's really incredible to work with actors and realize that um, say two actors are talking to each other and one says one says darling, do you love me, and the husband says don't ask me that, right? Now what do you think don't ask me that means? I mean, just your first guess. What would you think he means by that?
Well, depending on how it's said, it could be you should
Exactly.
already know, or
Exactly, right? So,
yeah.
darling, do you love me? Don't ask me that. Or darling, don't you love me? Don't ask me that. Or darling, don't you love me? Don't ask me that. Or like there's so many different ways. And so what you want to avoid, what you need to do is you need to
Mhm.
find directors and artists who can take what you are writing
Mhm.
and create from that.
Mhm.
You as a writer, and I'm really glad you asked this question. You as a writer, when you are writing for audio, you are no longer in control of the final product.
How
That's
somebody
really important.
interprets the way a character speaks and
A
says things.
story is told 3 times. I heard this and I'm stealing it as my own because it makes me sound smart. A story is when it's written, when it's performed, and when it's edited. Same thing happens. You
Mm.
write, the passion of the person directs it, and then he edits it. Okay. Zach Efron was in a movie. I think it was a remake of Baywatch. I never saw it. But one of my friends was hanging out with Zach, and which makes me sound much more popular than I am. But he was hanging out with Zach, and Zach was saying that he was frustrated because his performance was edited
Mhm.
so that in one scene it was not just one performance. It was like 3 or 4 or 5 different performances that were edited together.
Mhm.
Now you can try and control that. You can try and write in your script, this line needs to be said this way, or this line is said concerned with a touch of anxiety, and the character is thinking about his childhood trauma, right? That's a terrible way to write
Okay.
for audio because one, you can't make people do that. It doesn't work.
Mhm.
It doesn't work at all. And then two, it loses a lot of the beauty and power of writing for audio or writing for film, which is your script is no longer, unlike a novel, unlike a short story, your script is no longer a complete world in and of itself, right? You're
Mhm.
not controlling the entire audience or reader's experience. What your
Mhm.
script is, that is, if you're not directing or producing your own stuff, but even
Right.
then, your script is a proposal or a gesture
Mhm.
to another artist to receive, process, and then create based off of that or in response to that.
Mhm.
Um, Good scripts are very striking and you can direct, you can be particular, you can put in sound effects, you can, you can find your own style of writing, but ultimately the director or the producer will receive that script and then respond to that.
Mhm.
And so the trick or the craft of writing for audio is creating a world with the depth of reality, the depth of character, the strength of plot, and of desire in the characters, that the director can come up against your dialogue and say like, okay, what is this? And he or she investigates this and then comes up with something else in response to it. So you shouldn't try and prescribe everything. You should try and
Mhm.
develop strong enough characters so that you don't need or want to put everything into the audio. Instead,
Mhm.
you put enough into the audio to communicate the essentials of the plot, to communicate the action, to communicate the character, the subtext, and then you can talk to the director and have a good relationship with the director and say, "Oh, this is my vision for this, is what I'm thinking." But then it's up to the director to sort of create the world around
Mhm.
it as well.
I think that's such an interesting difference between these two mediums. When you're writing a story, you're trying to sort of sit inside your reader's brain and say, "This is how I meant the story to be felt and
Yes,
understood, and here is my take, and I want you to hear it in with my intonation and so on, and I'm going to try to put that into paragraphs of description and so on." But in this one here, I loved how you described you're creating something that you are intending another artist to take and provide their own inflection. And that's how you get, like, you take Shakespeare, you can read the words on a page, and then you'll have 7 different takes on
it's a great
Hamlet,
example. Yeah,
you know,
and none of them are wrong, and none of them are right. I
and
mean,
that's the beauty
there
of it.
are ranges. There are ranges.
Right, right.
Some of them I think are
Uh,
wrong,
uh,
but but
right.
but the that's what it's intended to do. And so one of the thoughts that I wanted to share was, so I studied classics in undergrad, and when we would translate from Latin or Greek or whatnot, one of the things that my teachers would say would be translation is interpretation, right?
Mhm.
You can't render a Latin poem in English because it's not Latin anymore. It's a different poem. You're making
Right.
judgments on it. When you adapt a work or a short story for audio, it is a different story. It might have the same characters, it might have the same general plot, but it is a different story. And if you try and retain the novel in the adaptation, it'll be just a bad audio story. I thought of one thing that we could close or wrap up on. So
Perfect. Mhm.
this is a script written by me, but it wasn't really. It was written by Kylie Hatch. So this is a trailer
Mhm.
um, that we've been working on. So this is a trailer for the Night Train series. And it starts with exterior Chicago streets, dawn of December 31, 1879. Exterior, EXT just stands for exterior, INT. We have sound of train idling at the station. I don't say what sound or anything like that. Voiceover, the Merry Beggars presents, sound of the street outside the station. People, Siri is trying to eavesdrop on our conversation. Um, the sound of the street outside the station. Good morning, Chicago. Wake up. The world is changing. Don't be left behind. New Year's Eve, 1879. Train whistle blares. Sound of train traveling on tracks on the night train. Interior, Paul's bedroom. Paul Emerson Mallard. The night train leaves today. We promised Daddy we wouldn't be late. Oh no, did the night train leave without me? I'm up. I'm up. What mysteries are in store for the night train? The accidents aren't happening in the night train. Are accidents? Someone is trying to sabotage the night train, and so on and so forth. And it goes on. It's just 5 pages. And
Mhm.
let me actually pull up a slightly different script. And I think I can share audio on this as well. So let me. I apologize for the delay. Um,
No worries.
Here you go. Awesome. So this is. But let me see if I can. I can. Can I share audio?
Yeah, there should be a little button that says, when sharing the window or tab, play browser audio.
I don't think I can actually. because this is video live. Oh well, you guys will just have to listen to the trailer
We'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, but in this trailer, it's only 2 pages long. This goes through and tries to display the entire on the night train in just 2 pages. And if you look through this script, the Merry Beggars presents Good Morning Chicago, Wake Up, the World is Changing. It is New Year's Eve, 1879, on the night train. Paul Mr. Mallet, the night train leaves today, so on and so forth. You'll notice that there isn't very much sound design, and there isn't any music direction whatsoever.
Okay.
It's just the bare essentials of what the teaser trailer needs to be to communicate the overall idea of the series and get people to listen, right? And this is a good example of what is a script like versus what is the actual audio like. You as a writer need to communicate the plot. You need to have a really good plot, a really tight plot, well-developed plot, but you don't need to create the final product. And that's a really important distinction. And so you can look at this script, sort of see how we put it together, and then compare it to the actual audio trailer that's available or will be available next week on thenighttrain.com. So I don't know how helpful I've been, but I hope I've given sort of a glimpse into what adapting and writing for audio looks like. If you want to write for audio and you want to get your work published or produced, I'd recommend start listening to old radio shows. Start listening to Johnny Dollar, which has a great example of a narrative device. The entire show is just his expense account. And he goes through each item, and it's this like action-packed detective adventure. X-1 is a great show. The Shadow, The Whistler, Gunsmoke, 5-Minute Mysteries, The Mercury Theater. All of those are great ways to learn the audio form and then start developing original writing for it. And if you want to be produced, get in touch. We're constantly looking for writers.
So I think that's a fantastic place to wrap right there. So if people do want to reach out to you, if they have stuff that they want to send to you, where can they go? Who should they expect to email, or is there a contact form? What's that like?
We will have a contact form. We're redeveloping part of our website right now. For right now, you can just email Peter at themerrybeggars.com. That's PETER at THEMERRYMBEGGARS.com.
Fantastic. Well, friends, I hope that this was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed this. And man, I hope some of us follow up on it and send the Merry Beggars some stuff. Otherwise, check out the trailer linked in the show notes. Thanks again, Peter, for coming back. This was amazing. And I think that there's a lot of really practical advice that was covered in here that just helps writing in general, whether or not you go the radio route. But thanks again for coming back. It was great to have you with us.
Was my pleasure, Dominic.